to be able to address as a political conversation, you know, because even last night, as part of my campaigning, I had to visit a local farm, and the Irish Farmers Association of Ireland was giving a presentation, and there was a sign on the wall about which pregnant cow do we slaughter now. And there was like a national cull in November where the European Central Organization is forcing on our own Indigenous farming population just really brutal measures that an awful lot of people aren't aware of, you know, and what you said about the cement industry as well, I could certainly address some of that. Anyway, what Paul asked me to look at today, so I'm going to switch into my field, which is art and design, which seems a bit of a shift to softer politics at the moment, but we could certainly address the harder politics as well in a different conversation maybe. Okay, I'm going to share here, Paul, just let me know if it's sharing. Is that sharing, Paul?
It's coming through now. Yes, locating the feminine.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to speak, I suppose, for comparing now where we were, but we're looking at practice-based research in the arts, and to give a little bit of a different, I suppose, perspective on research methodologies as well. So to introduce myself, I'm a lecturer in the Department of Fine Art and Education at TUS, so background as an artist and writer. I'm a principal investigator of the ADEPT research group and postgraduate research supervisor here at TUS. So the areas of my research up to this point really have been contemporary fine art, particularly lens-based media practices, feminist theory and discourse, including psychoanalytic perspectives. And as an artist, community-based, socially engaged art, and even more and more so political activism, I suppose my research has led me now directly to become or try to become a politician. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about, I suppose, research methods first, so PBR, practice-based research. It's very common within art and design education and you know, I suppose the fine arts. It's one I've used consistently. Also ethnography to a certain extent. I think it's always quite interesting when artists apply something like ethnography, because it's always from a kind of slightly more creative or maybe radical perspective, or you know, distorting the boundaries of research methodologies. And of course, autoethnography, and within the arts, the positioning of the researcher as a kind of a conscious, self-reflective and subjective position has been extremely important. Essential to the arts, obviously, because artists tend to be quite self-reflective. But I think when looking at paradigms of research as well, like to kind of break that empirical model of objective, the idea of the objective researcher, particularly when you have an objective researcher looking upon an Indigenous community or a community of place or specification. Okay, so my influence as well, I suppose, in coming to this this kind of praxis or the meeting of theory and praxis was, I spent time in Finland, about 13 years actually, and it was very influenced there. I suppose they're leading in the field of practice-based research in the arts, and I translated their first cohort of PhD projects in 2006 into English. And what really influenced me there was what they were actually doing, even creating languages. They were reinventing language within their field of practice to bring in new conceptual paradigms to the field. So it was, I suppose, really cutting edge. And that idea of being able to break the boundaries of a research field and look for, I mean, exactly what's been said there, different types of partnership or different types of way of looking at academia and breaking those old, very rigid kind of silos of research is very, very important. So I suppose as a research methodology, it can be applied as well to other fields beyond obviously fine arts and design. But the idea of visualizing research, and Graham Allens, they produce a very interesting, I suppose, visualization of how this research comes about. The research follows the creative studio journey. It moves between studio work and reflection upon studio work, documented through journals, artist books, drawing together narratives, retelling the stories, and kind of inserting that idea of creativity. And when you think about Indigenous culture, Indigenous storytelling, oral traditions, that it allows the space as well for these ways of telling and reconstructing knowledge and reconstituting knowledge that may have been lost, can be written back in from the oral as well into the written narrative or into the visual, because not everything is always, you know, textual. Part of this as well, like there's an artifact created. So in the context of my field, it's usually a visual exhibition or a book, or a collection of poetry, or an album, or a dance performance. It could be as well, obviously, to do with Indigenous cultures, you know, traditions that maybe are outside of discourse or academic discourse. And that is the center, that is the most important thing within the research field. The written report or the academic write-up or thesis, dissertation or exegesis, it's only a component of it. So it's kind of an ancillary, it's not the focus. And also the journal is very important, or the PDP, which is an ongoing reflexive space for the researcher to become also very self-aware of where they are positioned in relation to the field of knowledge or what they're trying to reconstruct or construct. I'm just going to talk about a couple of projects, I suppose. This one, when addressing now the issue of the feminine and what the feminine might be. The feminine I'm kind of focusing on here is what I would describe as the wandering or the exiled feminine. And it's very much associated, I think, with the displacement of the attribution of any type of sacredness or divinity or worth towards the feminine, particularly within European discourse and academic discourse. So as a young artist, I remember being very fascinated by this novel. It's the story of Nadia. And it was from that surrealist movement, which I suppose beginning of the 20th century in European art had a huge impact on literature and art. But I always found it deeply problematic that there was something at the core of this that was kind of voyeuristic, obviously towards the feminine, but also displacing a certain type of feminine, pushing it out, exiling it. So the story of Nadia is Andre Breton. Now he's seen as the quintessential father of surrealist poetry and a massive influence on the visual movement as well. But if you look at feminist discourse like Pollock, Mulvey, Parker, Berger, you know, there's this kind of critique of, I suppose, what we'd look at here, and these are real photographs, so kind of we look at them in the context of the 21st century, incredibly predatory, incredibly voyeuristic and exploitative. This image on the left is literally the surrealist artists, many of them the poets, and the idea that the feminine was something that was held in the mind's eye. It was often, they called it the femme enfant, or the woman child, and it was something that the men could dream of. She was the door to the subconscious, that she opened the door to art and the visionary experience. And like, it was almost like through her, often an actual woman in the real world, these men could access the feminine aspect of themselves, or what was the essence of art. And of course, many of these women were completely exploited in life. So some of the kind of these femmes enfants were Leona Giselle, Camille Giseline D, who was actually Nadia. And her real story, like when I started to dig it out in my own work, she was 24 years of age. She'd given birth to an illegitimate daughter at 18 in a rural village in Lille, and been completely exiled from her community and family and sent basically to Paris. Lived for a brief period of time there. Unfortunately for her, met Breton, had a massive nervous breakdown after it and was institutionalized and died in her late 30s. She never kind of recovered after this encounter with this great surrealist artist. But there were many others, like they kind of looked at the feminine as something that could almost be exploited. You know, you had Giselle Prazinos as well, 14-year-old poet. She was one of the few female subjects that was ever allowed into their ontologies of surrealist poetry. And they also saw this kind of rebellious outsider, wandering, displaced feminine as a symbol of the forthcoming revolution that would destabilize the capitalist system, and, you know, which was a kind of an idealization projected into the body of the woman, or a particular type of woman. I suppose when we go back to the research methods, like I was using when I was creating this body of work in response to Breton's, and kind of from a feminist perspective, collage, bricolage, that kind of fragmentation is very important to piece together the reconstitution of a fragmented narrative. Creative writing, directly in response to Breton's text, using narrative drift, détournement and dérivé, are conceptual paradigms within conceptual early 20th century art as well. And it's very much about displacement within the city, but using small gestures of revolution against the system, and autoethnography. So going to Paris, the novel itself has a number of photographic plates by Jacques-André Beauford. So I was responding to that. going at a particular time when there was an exhibition on as well there over the Christmas, and actually going and walking the streets based on the book, rephotographing and wondering what she might know. Of course, she's been dead since 1941, but my question is, who is this feminine? What does she look like today? And also, what does it actually mean for women that are in that position, or others into that position of being the outsider, the othered feminine? And often, unfortunately, it is, you know, absolute destitution, impoverishment, institutionalization. What I was doing as well is writing kind of a subject, the subject, the feminine voice, back in to answer Breton, like to answer this kind of ridiculous idealization of the feminine. So also, you know, that question of, you know, maybe the archetypal force, or that kind of symbolic feminine that is still there today, considered the muse and what she might be. So I created a series called Postcards from a Life. The idea of the postcard as well was something that it seemed to be was a very feminine trope of communication. It was also, rather than from a place, it was from the idea of a life, the idea of a feminine. It was postcards from that existence, maybe that vagabond on the edge existence. And like my area of, I suppose, visual practice would be lens-based photographic. So I was skewing time as well, using archival materials of her direct correspondence with Breton. And then, like, the way it was actually created was a series of over 10 days, the journey, and I suppose rewriting her story back in again. It was presented as a series of diptychs that included a map, psychogeographical mapping, a narrative response, and then these 12 postcard images that were playing with time and also identity. So that dissemination, I suppose, in the arts, like you'd be sending it out to, this was kind of quite well received in the area of contemporary fine art practice, memory, the archive, the reconstitution of memory, and it kind of toured quite well. So I suppose good for dissemination. It kind of pushed me into that area as well of furthering my own practice into writing, and using the book or the artist book as well as a way of containing and rewriting a story, because there's so much authority I think we have invested in the book itself, as knowledge, or like believable knowledge. So I kind of skewing the idea of the real and the imaginal, that we can reinvent our stories and we can rebuild our histories back in those things, particularly the feminine voice where it's being completely erased, or the Indigenous voice and the Indigenous feminine. And taking, I suppose, agency in creating those stories and putting them back into books. So this is extracts, I suppose, from my own wandering through the city, going to the places where she went, and it was incredibly tragic. Her life was very brief and very short, but it was a really emblem of what can happen, you know, and you know, I suppose when these idealized feminines are not really examined. I also went to the Charcot archives, and Didi Huberman's deconstruction really of this period of photographic practice, and also the early days of psychoanalysis, when you, in the Charcot archives, you have this creation of a visual pathology, really, an invention of the concept of hysteria. And he really, this contemporary, I suppose, conceptual and quite a feminist writer as well, he totally deconstructs it, and he said, like, what we have here is what we understand today is PTSD. So many of these women that were institutionalized in the Salpêtrière, they were suffering from physical traumas, like, you know, poverty, being completely outcast, and for many of them, actually, being institutionalized was the only safe place where they had a roof over their heads. But they were subjected to this kind of forensic, medical, and psychoanalytic investigation where all of this was projected onto the body of the woman as well. What was very strange as well, there I found this other archive was linking, I suppose, pre-medical ideas of what was wrong with these women, you know, this demonization of them as well, literally, back to the early medieval period of witchcraft, you know, and linking that kind of lack of understanding and ignorance and violence against the feminine. It, you know, it was really, wasn't much of a leap between the witchcraft trials and then what was the early days of psychoanalysis, particularly in the mental asylums. What came through as well when you're looking at the archetypal feminine is this figure of Melusine, and she was running through all of the surrealist literature and art as well, and this kind of projecting onto the othered feminine. So she was founding myth for the House of Anjou, French royalty. And many of the kind of, you find it as well, like in many of the other royal houses of Europe as well, this idea of the accepted feminine and then the one that is literally cast out. She was of the Fae or Fairy, which is very interesting. You're thinking about our own indigenous heritage here. She moved between the worlds. She occupies a liminal state. So displaced from the land as well, you know. She was hybrid, shapeshifter, of water, fluidity, dream, the subconscious. She comes to land occasionally, like the Silky we have in the mythologies, marries a mortal man for a fixed period of time, but it's always the notion that he's enchanted, and it's exactly the same in the surrealist manuscripts as well. Like we have it in Supolo's Paris Peasant, like where he has a vision of a mermaid in the window of a shop in an arcade. There's a taboo against seeing her true form, so as in like she is not accepted, you know, as who she is, and then she vanishes back into the depths or the other world. But she's often used as a metaphor, inspiration, or the numinous, or transgression, or what is permitted within, I suppose, certain conservative tropes, like of the masculine as well, of what, you know, she's the door, like the release. Some of the other sources I was looking at, I suppose, Maria Dervaux-Herbeck and her description of what she describes narrative drift in recent literature and film, including Breton's Nadia. And she describes a process whereby certain subjects, particularly certain women, succeed in escaping the all-encompassing, usually male gaze of a centralized narrative authority. And this authoritative position is often reinforced with the aid of ideological systems, including those of anthropology, ethnography, and psychoanalysis. However, where the subject moves beyond the scopic abilities of the narrator, the narrative literally drifts and doubles back upon itself, and the narrator, rather than the object, becomes visible. And in Breton's case, these are the moments in his story where he can only speculate upon Nadia's existence as she vanishes into the city and the unknown, and he's forced to contemplate his own life and intentions. And I think that's important. It's like kind of forcing the mirror, like turning the mirror around, you know. So some of these qualities, here we have up on the top as well, that is quite an interesting film by Leo Carax, Les Amants de Bonneuf. And it's an artist is the subject, the seeing subject. Literally, she's actually going blind in it, but she's the one that, and there's a reverse, and the muse is a male vagabond. It's a very interesting kind of switching of those positions of what the masculine and feminine can be and what transgression and domesticity can be. And of course, Agnes Varda's Vagabond. There's been a lot written about this movie here on the bottom, and you have a feminine character. Again, she chooses to up and leave the kind of capitalist domestic, and she begins to wander, and she's literally murdered off at the end of it, you know. So it's at the consequence of the feminine, of straying, it can be quite substantial, like, you know, going beyond what you're permitted. So the characteristics of living beyond or transgressing domestic convention, being cast out to wander and displaced, and that includes displacement from the land, familial ties, and particular roles. A destabilization physically can lead to the psychological destabilization. The arriving and disappearance from shadowy origins, or being hybrid or between the worlds. And then the projection, then the kind of projection of that, the kind of spiritual projection of that being darkness or the demonic or the uncanny, slightly familiar but unrecognizable. The other feminine, and the violence like that's perpetrated against that is something that I suppose began to consider an awful lot based on that. Now, this is a book that's coming out in 2025 with Demeter Press, and I have a chapter in this, and I'll just, how am I doing on time, Paul?
Martina, maybe 2 or 3 minutes would be great.
2 or 3 minutes. Okay, yeah. So just to speak a little bit about this. So this is a collection of quite interesting essays. So you're probably familiar with Demeter Press, like they publish a lot of kind of feminist, Marxist, leftist, quite a lot of books on motherhood and different types of femininity. But I'm lucky enough to have a chapter in this. And what I wrote about with this is specifically the story of Bridget Cleary, and Bridget Cleary was the last witch that was burnt in Europe. You will notice my name is Cleary as well. So it was within my own clan, like, that this happened. And, you know, like, I suppose it's haunted the family a bit as well. And, you know, looking at what, you know, why was she burnt? What might it have been? And this chapter is looking at that, but also like the conclusions that I draw on it are connecting the colonization of the spirit, particularly under the Catholic Church, and the absolute abjection and the casting out of the feminine, which had been in the Celtic spirituality, that actually led to Bridget's burning. She was burnt around 1895, and they said that she was possessed by the fairies. Like, her husband literally took her and cast her into the fire, but he also used the local community and her in-laws to do it, and managed to completely convince them that she was had been taken by the fairies. You know, so it's quite a horrific but real life story. So, like, within this chapter, I examined that, why this might have happened, and also compare it to recurring patterns within the 21st century as well. So the murder of Imelda Riney in Clare, the murder of Emer O'Loughlin, and Sophie Toscan de Plantier. And I suppose the conclusion I come to in this as well is that all of them are this feral feminine, or the feminine that's othered, particularly the creative feminine, leads to actually the socio-political matrix and the symbolic order that allows their murder to happen, but also it enables it, but it also enables a kind of a system, a judicial system, that most of those cases, you know, the women were either buried. So in some of the cases, the murderer has not been found, or the situation has not been solved. So it is extremely dangerous. Like, while we idealize, you know, this idea of the the fae, or the feminine that's very free and liberated, it actually has real political violent consequences on the body of real life women right up to the present. And I kind of come to the conclusion in that until we kind of deconstruct that symbolic matrix and understand the shadow, that kind of shadow of why we're projecting that, that is coming from this kind of trauma of, like, the unresolved trauma of colonization in Ireland as well, of what has happened, you know, what's been projected onto the feminine in particular. This is going to continue, and it's going to remain unsolved. So it's coming out in 2025. So if you have a chance, please have a look at it. Okay, Paul, I think I might be out of time there.
Martina, thank you. I think the word that sort of resonates with me in some ways is serendipity. It's amazing how, when you bring a group of people from such diverse backgrounds together, that there emerges themes. And I think it's amazing that you finished on Bridget Cleary, because I know it's something that Maui and myself has spoken about in that particular situation in Tipperary, which happened quite close to where we live. Resonates and is still held by the community as a violence against community, against women, and against the Indigenous, you know. So I think that was fantastic. I think the other thing I'm just going to say is that I have migrated myself from development studies, social science, into, I teach now in Limerick School of Art and Design, and it's been really refreshing to be among artists and artist researchers and artist practitioners, because there's a freedom and a thoroughness and a reflection that you've reflected, Martina, in academic discourse within the arts, that within development, I think we can learn a lot. There's a lot more synergies between how research is undertaken in art and design and in development studies. And I think there could be an awful lot more overlap in terms of bringing development studies into art and design, if that makes sense, because an awful lot of yourself, Martina, and other practitioners that I've met in Limerick School of Art and Design are politically active feminists, see their art as a political statement.
If I could just respond there, I think maybe as artists, we learn to trust these intuitive ideas that we make it up, or we come to an inspiration, like, or that's, you know, an insight into something, and in the arts you trust that. Like, it struck me when I did a residency with some archaeologists a number of years back, and when I was observing their methods in the field, I'd always gone to that, considering, like, those fields are so scientific and exact and rigorous, and everything has to be proven like so perfectly. But when I was observing them dig up these artifacts and draw their conclusions, it was as creative as any artist in coming to these speculative ideas of this means this is the way people lived, you know, or, you know, the attribution of knowledge and the rightness and correctness of knowledge, you know. So I think maybe that kind of confidence we have as artists in believing and imagining is something that we could lend to the empirical research areas, and like to say, admit like that a lot of what anthropologists and ethnographers make up is totally subjective projection. You know? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Martina. What I might do is, I know you need to go, but if there's any questions from the floor before Martina leaves, I mean, I'm sure you'd be happy to take them, time permitting. So is there anything, any comments anybody would like to make, reflections?
Okay, thanks so much for inviting me, Paul, and I'd love
to.
Sorry,
maybe Maui, did you?
Yeah.
You need to unmute, I think.
I just want, you're there now. You're up against 5 men, so good luck to you, girl. I'm just doing the solidarity with you. Fair play.
Thank you.
Go, girl.
I know they're afraid of me already, so that's an advantage.
Be feral.
Thanks so much, Paul, and I love to meet everybody. I wish I had a bit more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina.
Bye bye.